Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with Professor Gifford, who was the first dean of the faculty of Amherst College, arriving in 1967, having been appointed in 66, and served for 12 and a half distinguished years until the spring of 1979. It's great to have you here. Prosser is our first dean of faculty, and that's a salient point that I'd like to start with. I came in 1962 when there was a dean of admissions, the legendary Bill Wilson, who let you in, so to speak. And then once you were in as an undergraduate, there was a dean, Scott Porter. Yeah. And he was dean of everything. Nice. And symptomatically, the code of behavior in the catalog in one sentence was that Amherst expected you to behave like a gentleman. And if you didn't, you were gone. And there were no judicial boards. It was a very simple life. Shortly thereafter, there was a dean of students, and Scott Porter died at the beginning of 1966, and you were selected to be the first dean of the faculty. You had some obligations and responsibilities that you had to meet, so if I'm correct, you didn't start until January of 1967.
That's correct.
And previous to that, you had compiled a very impressive record of education, law school, Rhodes Scholar, history PhD. And I'd like to begin by asking you to retrace those steps with the addition or with the contextualization of what was to come. That is to say that you were going to be a very important administrator at Amherst College. And I assume there was some experience that led up to that other than being a good student.
Not much. I was, 66, I was teaching African history at Yale, both graduate and undergraduate. And I had a very nice office and a good teaching schedule, and I was turning my dissertation into a book and anticipated staying at Yale indefinitely. One afternoon, it was pouring rain, and it must have been early fall of 66. This large man in a dripping poncho appears in my office and says, "Hello, I'm Cal Plimpton. And I believe in education, and I think you believe in education." So we chatted a bit, and he said, "You know, I'd like you to come up to Amherst for lunch." And I said, "Well, I can do anything for lunch." So we agreed on a Sunday, and that Sunday my wife, who was a very good athlete, was in the finals of the paddle tennis tournament at New Haven Lawn Club. So she and her partner played the finals, lost, and then we got in the car and raced like hell up to Amherst to find that this wasn't a luncheon with Cal and Ruth, this was a luncheon with the Committee of Six. And I never heard of the Committee of Six, sounded very Venetian to me. So at lunch, I sat next to Arnold Ahrens, and who I did know slightly because he had a connection with Woods Hole. Mm-hmm. And so I said to him, "Well, when do you need this person?" He said, "A year ago." So then we had a very difficult decision because we fixed up a house in New Haven. We had a very good situation. But on the other hand, to go from assistant professor to dean of the faculty at Amherst was sort of a challenge. So I came in the winter of 67, January, discovered that at least 3 of my senior colleagues had wanted the job. And of course I had no Amherst connections at all. So the first thing was to find out how Amherst worked. Well, that's not easy to find out. But there was a great advantage in being the first dean of the faculty because nobody knew what a dean of the faculty should do. So I sort of had my own mandate, and I kind of made it up as we went along. And got somewhat accustomed to the Committee of Six and some of the other peculiarities. And it wasn't very long before both Columbia and Berkeley blew. Columbia with fire, and Berkeley with just lots of turmoil. So it became clear that the Amherst student body, which was bright and small, was going to also take this up, which they did fairly quickly.
Let me interrupt because I'm curious. Things were more casual in those days, as is evident. But how did Cal know about what Dr. Johnson calls a lexicographer, a harmless drudge like you, in your office at Yale?
Well,
was there advertising? Were you aware that this was a position?
No. Cal, I was not aware, and I was not seeking anything. Other people had asked me whether I wanted to be X and Y, and I said no. But Cal had pretty good intelligence, and his brother, half-brother, Francis, had been in the same class with my father at Harvard Law School, and they kept up legal relations in New York. So he obviously, he knew what he was about, but I had no idea what he was about.
Or what you were about.
And it was a very difficult decision for us because, but we decided to try it. And in fact, that's kind of characteristic of my career. If you look back now, it looks like it's coherent, but every single major move was completely A, unanticipated, and B, unplanned. So it was a series of ad hoc, opportunistic moves. And when I came to Amherst, I had no idea. Well, first of all, I had no idea we were heading into the late 60s and early 70s. And secondly, I had no idea I'd be here 12 years. So, which were fairly formative years, actually, in the college.
No question about that.
I think there was one woman, Rose Oliver, was the only woman on the faculty when I came, and 26 when I left.
She and I came in '62. And I don't think you would have been there, but they had to, because her husband, John, taught at the university, and they had to ascertain how much John made so that Rose would not get more money. So there were, that is one of the subjects we will come back to, I'm sure, because it culminates in '75 with coeducation. But
right,
you as dean were spearheading an effort to get more women on the faculty, and not necessarily assuming, but somehow this was...
Well, assuming that diversity in the faculty was good, whatever
no matter
happened.
what happened. Yeah.
But there's one dimension that you asked me that I didn't pick up, and that is, in addition to my teaching at Yale, Kingman Brewster, who was then president, had gotten money from the Carnegie Corporation because he believed, and I think Carnegie, the foundation, also believed that people ought to be able to interrupt their undergraduate education. So he asked me to take on what was called a 5-year BA, and this was at the beginning of the Vietnam War. So we had to have a university cover, but it wasn't an academic program. So we selected 12 students. I modeled it with colleagues' help pretty much on the Peace Corps selection process. And they had to be self-sustaining in the field. That is, they had to either get their room and board or make enough money to do that. But they didn't have any academic fees to Yale, and their only obligation was to write a letter, at least twice a month, back to me. And a colleague of mine, Ken Keniston, who's now a retired professor at MIT, but he and I split the field trip. So I talked to 6 of our guys who were in Africa and India, and he talked to those in Latin America and Asia and Pacific, Asian Pacific. And it was a very interesting program, but that had already sort of gotten me into the administrative game. And then when Kingman heard that I was thinking of leaving, he said, well, how would you like to take on the Yale-Vassar merger? And I, as loud as how I wouldn't. Fortunately, it never happened. I think it would have been a big mistake for both institutions. But so I was flirting with the edge of the administrative business, although I did teach at least a course every year and often every semester here.
Did you?
Yeah.
Forgotten that.
Because I didn't want to be perceived as simply one of them.
The administrative duties you took on had some precedent. What I don't hear is what you assumed about what you found attractive, if you gave it thought, about a small liberal arts undergraduate institution as against a university. Amherst's reputation obviously was something that made it attractive, but did you at the time, because this became an important issue, I think, during your years, certainly things have changed radically here from liberal arts, emphasis on teaching and smallness and rapport, to hardly university magnitude, but there are people who miss that and contrast it to what they think is a university, encroaching university influence. In other words, way back then, presumably Amherst was quite different from, as a, 1,200 students.
Well, it was clearly different in size, and the faculty, I mean, my whole faculty was about the size of the history department at Yale.
Yeah.
123, I think, or 130 people. But Yale has a very strong humanities tradition. I mean, that's probably its strongest suit. And I had been in an experimental program as an undergraduate which emphasized the humanities, and I had many colleagues in the humanities, and I was in the history department. So I think the main attraction was, first of all, Cal's persuasiveness. I mean, he's such an unusual guy that working with him was, he really was. He was Delphic in some ways, but he was also, as an MD, we used to be the last two people to interview all the candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And I would ask about, academic, what they were teaching and all of this. And he would find out that the guy's mother had jumped out the window when he was 13 years old. And I mean, he'd get all this stuff that I had no way of accessing. But the strength of a liberal arts college, and of course it wasn't clear then that 5 colleges was going to be important, but that became one of my central concerns. We got the federal money for the first buses, and we got the 5 college appointments, and there was a lot of work on that.
He turned this over to you the way Brewster tried to turn Vassar, Yale over to you.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, I used to go, or sometimes I went to the meeting of the presidents of the 5, which again was very. Tom Mendenhall was then president of Smith, and my wife had gone to Mount Holyoke, so I had a certain loyalty there.
Well, presumably you were ideal because other things in your past led you, or right off the bat, you were very much of a supporter of this, and
Yeah.
it was not necessarily a feeling that was pervasive in university. I mean, is that fair enough?
I think that's delicately put. Yeah, I believed in cooperation because I saw it at work academically at Yale, and it was quite clear to me that we could do things jointly that we couldn't do individually. And as it turned out, of course, Amherst was the net importer and net exporter of students, even though we were the smallest.
Mhm.
So that was an excitement, but that really developed later. That
Over
was not a,
time,
that
yeah.
was not an initial, because
Well,
Hampshire wasn't even founded.
I was going to say, Hampshire's first class came after you.
Yeah,
So it really was for college at that time.
right,
And,
right.
but that I know. Curricularly,
Yeah.
I'm getting back to the liberal arts
Mhm.
tradition. That became it's certainly into the ward years, after all the things that had transpired. I don't know if he addressed every project and every task as if it were the most challenging and most important, but I'm jumping ahead, but speaking of the curriculum as against in other institutions, when we put the ILS curriculum in place, he said something to the effect that this was a greater accomplishment than going co-education, which seems a bit extreme, or maybe
Yeah.
not, but you were instrumental also in defining, if I remember correctly, characteristics, not requirements, but of what a fully liberally educated young man or woman at that time
We went
would
through, in my time, we went through 2 accreditation reviews.
be. Mhm.
And I was trying to figure out, it must have been 68 and 78 or 69 and 79, because I think one of them was just as I was about to leave.
Mhm.
And those, of course, were big self-examination processes, which was very good because it got me to know a number of the faculty members that I hadn't really worked with. Now what else? You said something else that...
But that was a time when one had to be very exact and explicit and
Well, the thing about Amherst was that quite apart from 5 college cooperation, the tradition of cooperative teaching was strong here. So that the notion of 2 or 3 people from different departments teaching together was, to me, attractive, and
which they had done in the previous curriculum
Right.
too, and indeed in the quote new curriculum which was in place. Now, when I mentioned the liberal arts, you spoke about the humanities, but this is also an aspect of a small liberal arts educational institution, and that is a great preponderance of faculty in the classroom, if not exclusively,
Right.
whereas presumably Yale graduate students taught or sectioned, and the amount of labor-intensive work that went on in these courses with small sections mandated and taking faculty members away from their departments to teach a general education course, that was quite unusual as against your
Well,
Yale experience.
no, it wasn't.
Like,
I've got to back up a little bit. After the war, or in fact during the war, the Second World War, there was a general feeling that we got to get back to the basic humanities. So Columbia put in great books, Harvard put in whatever they called it, Amherst did the new curriculum, Yale did directed studies, which I was in. They were all essentially the same thing, trying to integrate knowledge more and to base it in some fundamental way on some of the great things of the past. And I think that came up because people felt, my God, Germany had great culture, but what happened, you know? So the program that I was in at Yale was, first of all, small, only 30 people, and it was taught by young assistant professors, but almost all of whom became Sterling professors. I mean, these were people on the rise. So, and it was deliberately integrated with philosophy at the center, history, literature. So I was familiar with that model, and I believed in it.
oh.
And now again, I don't have no idea whether Cal knew any of that. He might have, but he might not have. And the other thing that was just luck was that having gone through Harvard Law School and being a member of the D.C. bar, even though I didn't practice, I could talk with lawyers. And when we got into the late 60s and early 70s, there was the council, the Harvard council at Ropes and Gray, was a wonderful old New Englander. I can't remember his name. But I talked to him on the phone, and he said, let me give you some advice. He said, make your procedures simple and clear, and stick to them. And for God's sake, don't get lawyers involved. Mm-mm. Because if you get one lawyer, you've got 7. Everybody. It was very good advice, but it was nonetheless important to be able to understand what these people were talking about. Mm-hmm. And but that was, again, that was just the way it broke. It was not anything that I planned, but it was a useful asset at times.
Just to complicate the curricular and use it as a way of moving towards what you've already brought up, we certainly will get to, and that is student behavior. One of the curricular issues that many institutions were facing at this time was the advent of Black Studies programs. And that doesn't fit the historical or generic categories that we're talking about.
Well, my PhD was in African history.
No, but I mean, if you look at what Horace Porter or C.P. Ward were saying at the time of the establishment of Black Studies, their definition of what a Black Studies program would be was precisely antithetical to what, because to them, it was the way Western civilization had operated, although it might have gone to African studies and other lands. The manner of presenting knowledge and the relationships between knowledge and experience and so on were really radically different. Now, I've experienced some of that directly and indirectly, but yet again, this is not something you foresaw, and I just think you have a lot to say about the formation of Black Studies in Amherst, and I know you were integral to the establishment of it.
About 3 or 4 years ago, I was using the Amherst archives because what's his name, ambassador to Mexico, Morrow was an Amherst graduate and distinguished, etc. But he and my grandfather knew each other, and there was correspondence and stuff. So I came up to use the files, and in the archival reading room there was a young black woman and man. So I said, well, what are you working on? And they said, we're working on the origin of Black Studies at Amherst. And I said, well, I can tell you something about that. And they looked absolutely astounded. They said, who the hell are you? So I gave them my name, and they said, yeah, we've read some letters by you. And that was we didn't pursue it. But yeah, it was very interesting because as an African studies, I mean, that's what I taught. I went to the early African studies meetings. Mm-hmm. And in those days, there were about 200, 300 people was African studies in the U.S. And I remember a meeting in Toronto or Montreal, maybe it's Montreal, when the first Black Studies sort of inroads, and they pulled the mics and the plugs on the cameras and stuff because they said this was honky stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't. I mean, you had to know, and it ultimately. But here, I chaired the 5-college. I can hardly call it a committee. It was guerrilla. You never knew. We met at Hampshire, and I never knew whether there were going to be 30 people or 200 people.
I think I was at one of those when one of the major agenda items or demands, that word gets thrown around rather freely, was that that the 5-college Black Studies Committee was autonomous, and that the funds were under their control, not the colleges. There were two aspects of this. One, that it would be 5-college, and two, that the funds would be under control of, I mean, there were many meetings, but I was one at Hampshire where Jackie Pritzon was just trying to herd the cats, and
well,
there was so much of that. I interrupt. I'd just like to hear you.
The leader was Mike Thelwell.
Oh, yes.
Who was Jamaican or Barbadian?
Jamaican.
Jamaican. Anyway, he was certainly Caribbean. And the Caribbean blacks had a quite different take on this, because they most of them had benefited from either English or French secondary education, in many cases, university education. So they were much less antithetical to the notion that Africa has something to do with it, because of Césaire and negritude and all, which most of our kids didn't know at all. And so that was one of the internal dynamics in all this. And I finally figured it out. It was a dress code. If Thelwell came in a ripped shirt and blue jeans with holes, you knew it was in for a bad meeting. But if he came dressed respectably, the signal was, look, let's have an honest conversation. And then when I presented it, you must have been there, to the Amherst faculty, when I presented he came in an immaculate Mao jacket, buttoned up to...
Dress code. Did Amherst, when it first arose, as one does in any pause in the action, set up a committee to establish it? And
establish Black Studies.
Yeah. And that was a committee of, Jim Denton was the only black faculty member, and he may have been, but he was a mathematician. But
right.
And then and then Gordy and Jan got the task of setting up Black Studies at Harvard.
And then we had visiting black faculty, but I don't know when that started.
But that, I mean, better and more valiant souls are not on the faculty, but the students just wouldn't, I mean, it just wasn't the way they thought their experience should be addressed, right?
Yeah.
And I remember Horace Porter saying, well, if Winthrop Jordan was teaching us, a white scholar whose, I forget the title, bestseller had just come out, that's one thing. I mean, and Gordy and Jan said, we're just not trained to do what you were.
Yeah.
How did one proceed? I can't quite remember. Obviously, everybody across the country institutionally was trying to answer the call for more black faculty, as if somehow.
Well, that was and that was very difficult, because the big institutions with big budgets got the first shot. But I just kept teaching. I kept teaching African history and literature. I taught them together.
Mm-hmm. Let me though go back to your other hat as dean of the faculty. How did you navigate through those waters? How did you get to where we got?
Well,
because the demands on Cal's in his living room, the black seizure of 4 buildings, and then the taking of the books in the library over they all emanated from a set of principles and demands that were really, to the
they were
untutored eye, irreconcilable with.
They were demands that we want to be in control.
Yeah.
We want to be in control of what we learn. We want to be. But ultimately, it wouldn't work. I mean, and I think the better ones saw that. When I was teaching, and I forget what, it must have been 72 or 3. It was very shortly after the black, remember when they locked the Converse and...
Yeah, the 4 buildings.
And I had to run a faculty meeting somewhere, in the theater or the gym.
In Kirby Theater.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of that meeting, the news came out that they had come out. So there was another item on the faculty resolution. We are glad you came out.
But
And we will now negotiate.
The next day, I was teaching again my seminar. I had about 15 kids. 2 of them were black. Unfortunately, I don't remember their names, but I remember them very well. They both went on to get PhDs at Yale. And what was his name? He was 19 years old, big, handsome guy. And he had been the spokesman for the non-negotiable demands and stuff in Johnson Chapel at one point.
Is this possibly Wilburn Williams?
Might be.
Anyway.
And I, of course, had spoken for the faculty. And the next morning he came in and I said, I really didn't expect you to be here. And he said, 19 years old, he said, you have your job and I have mine. He had realized that it was not personal. It was institutional and symbolic. And I had colleagues, including the president of Brown, for instance, who didn't realize that. They thought it was all, they're after me. Not at all. They were after the symbolic. He figured it out. And and it made all the difference. I mean, it was the key thing, I think, being an administrator in those years. You couldn't take it personally.
Well, 2 things. One is, it's extraordinary that the leaders at that time, like Horace Porter, were freshmen and sophomores.
Yeah.
And the editorials, I remember when the negotiations were over, there was an evocation of reasonable discourse and so on. And Horace Porter wrote an editorial in The Student contextualizing reason and discourse in a way that made it seem evasive and that they wanted activism, relation to Springfield, and not just the 5 colleges, the summer programs. There was real community building. And just as you've mentioned it, though, I happened to be reading it recently, and Cal's, it's marvelous words about Cal, that he knew not to take things personally after all these years.
Right. Well, it's crucial. I mean, it's crucial being an administrator anywhere. And Bart Giamatti, whom I knew well, and was a marvelous speaker, and I think on the whole a pretty good president, but the labor union unrest at Yale got to him. He thought, and that was a big mistake. That was the beginning of his downfall, because you can't invest. I mean, you've got to stick to your principles, but you can't invest yourself in a particular solution. And one of the things about being not only the first dean of the faculty, but in times that nobody had anticipated, you had free rein. I mean, you had to make it up as you went along, because there weren't any rules, right? So instinct and improvisation were very important.
Well, I'm thinking of 2 instances where, just coincidentally, the night of the 69 moratorium, you came to the Octagon in that tempestuous night, and if I'm not mistaken, Cal was in Texas.
I was in Texas.
And then when the spring of '72 under Ward, he was in Paris.
Yeah, but let's go back to the Octagon, because
I just want to get into the fact the buck stopped with you at these 2 explosive moments.
But the letter that we drafted,
yes.
I read, don't you remember, in the cage?
Yes. Back up, because I think contextualize that. I mean, that is one of the great moments, the moratorium of '69. And 2 days off, mass meetings. It's fair to say nobody knew exactly where this was heading.
Right.
And Cal pointed out that we are upset about injustice, racial injustice in America, the war in Southeast Asia, and everyone's picking on Amherst College. And really was, and what emerged was issues of governance. And one of the ways that the pressure released was your letter. I just wanted to contextualize that.
And
The letter to Nixon.
the letter to Nixon, and I remember reading it in a cage with hundreds of people.
800 is what the student reported.
And that was some experience. And then it got Leo Marx, of course, polished it, and
Yeah.
Cal signed it, and it went off and got published in the Times.
It published in the Times. It was a lead editorial. It was the front page of the New Republic. And when the next moratorium came along, they referred back to this letter. It got incredible.
Yeah.
But the moratorium was voted in on the weekend. It was for Monday and Tuesday. The letter was suggested at that faculty meeting when the moratorium was voted on? Or did this...
I honestly don't remember.
I'm trying to think, because it really was a way of, I don't mean to be cynical at all, but it took the target out of Amherst again.
Yeah, well...
And it was a terrific letter.
I forget the origins. I remember working on the letter in my office, and I remember Leo and I talked it through, and then I read it in the cage, and I think Cal didn't come back
Wait,
from Texas until, I remember him walking in the cage. Maybe he wasn't in Texas then, but he walked into the cage as I was reading
really?
the letter, and he was fairly astounded because 800 people milling around, and
Potentially rowdy. It's funny, David Eisenhower at the time was quoted by a UPI reporter as he was down at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner as saying that Cal had signed this with a gun to his temple, and that got bandied about, but then the minute he got back to Amherst, he said, no, I was just being flip off the cuff, and I tried to stop the story. But it wasn't, pardon the vernacular, but it wasn't Cal's thing to do a thing like this, but he saw.
yeah, I think he grasped the situation. And
I mean, he did later, a year or two later, he joined 37 presidents to sign a fairly vociferous letter, but by then...
I don't think he would have come up with that, though, initially as a way to respond.
Well, the tactic, which I thought, and you're the one to be credited with it, was a deflection away from policy, away from Nixon, by saying, more generally, look, we have this population in America that you have to temper.
Right.
Your actions are causing these outbursts and
Well, and of course,
disruptions.
it was not just the U.S. I mean, I was at Dorchester when the red helmets with
Went
their
through the streets.
with their bamboo staves and their motorcycle helmets, and so this was a sort of contagion that spread. The Italians were actually assassinating people.
One of the things, to move back to Black Studies, which I think was a very good sign, was that this moratorium and all those mass meetings and discussions, so to speak, tabled the black agenda. And at that time, the council or whoever was setting the agenda for the future, the Summer Commission and so on, did say, we have to take another day off. If you remember that, about 3 or 4 weeks later, there was another day off. It's called the Day of Concern, which culminated with a lecture by Ralph Ellison, who would remember that?
Oh, I don't know, honestly.
It was very well done for Amherst. And of course, everyone breathed a sigh of relief in the spring of '69, and then by the spring of '70, there was a rerun.
Well, I think one of the key things in the early go-round was that Thelwell, for whatever reasons,
Yeah.
decided that it made sense to be cooperative. That if we were going to get a 5-college program, and it was to his advantage to get one because UMass was very strong in black music and jazz and that sort of stuff, but they didn't have a lot of people in other fields. And
But once, I mean, titularly that was put in place, but Amherst's operation, you correct me if I'm wrong, settled into being an Amherst program, major department.
with some sand in the gears, but we got
Some sand in the gears.
we got there.
You got there.
Now what else?
Well,
dosage is an interesting phenomenon because Cal was very interested in that, and my first trip to Japan was with him actually. And Otis Carey, I don't know, do you ever?
Oh, I did AKP one term and met him there. Yeah.
And the Carey family, a couple of their kids knew our kids, so there were connections there. But I thought that was a terrific opportunity, and it gave us, because UMass had a long connection with Hokkaido, the northern university, and Smith had some dealings with China. So again, there seemed to be much greater possibilities. And in those days, people were concerned about Japan, not China was not yet on the high priority list. But I remember, this is skipping ahead, but I remember one of my last 5 college meetings, that the deans of the faculty provosts used to meet every 2 weeks, and we were the ones, quite honestly, who got things done. Presidents met occasionally for symbolic reasons. And UMass was going to stop teaching Chinese. And we said that doesn't make any sense. So we got the records of all the people who studied Chinese at UMass. They all had jobs. They had all done well academically. And we said, look, why are you getting rid of this? I mean, I could think of a lot of other things. And we saved it. We turned UMass around. And I'm sure they're very glad now that they didn't stop teaching Chinese.
You're talking about these cooperations, cooperative ventures, 5-college, doshisha, as if, as it turns out, this, say, like coeducation is the wave of the future. On the other hand, you take that example, it was a long haul against a lot of opposition. Was there, how do you characterize the opposition to 5-college cooperation? Because I can remember people standing up in the faculty clearly worried about Amherst's autonomy. Did that register? Are there places where the deans felt we just don't want to be a conglomerate?
Well,
it doesn't turn out to have been a great danger.
My approach on all of this stuff was just to do what I thought needed to be done. And if it couldn't be done, well, it couldn't be done. But I didn't get terribly hung up on the pro and con arguments. Because I thought it was demonstrable enough that there were advantages. And there were enough people, both undergraduates and faculty, who saw some of the advantages. So, just sort of press ahead.
Cal used a metaphor once about his presidency, he said two things in an interview. He said, one, there was a master of Clare College whom he respected greatly, who said, we ought to stand in front of the mirror in the morning and say, you are evil. You are very evil, but you are a necessary evil. And the other said he is very suspicious of anybody who considered themselves an administrator and made much of this. He said, it's what I happen to do, and the metaphor he used was, I just want to keep the ball rolling. And it, of course, was Cal, who was 6'3" or 4, it helped. And he was an Amherst family man, and he was a patrician, and this was something he saw himself as a caretaker of.
He'd also run the medical faculty at AUB,
yeah.
American University of Beirut. So, and he had lots of guts. He went over there when the middle of the shooting. No, he was, but he could be absolutely Delphic. He'd say something, and you had no idea, A, whether it was intended to be funny or not, and B, whether he was, he really meant it, and what level he meant.
And then the eyebrows would go up, as if he was rather surprised too. I did the faculty minute for him, and I just looked back on those years and thought, we were very, very lucky to have this equanimity.
Yeah.
And in his final commencement address, he talked about being a servant and likened it to being a doctor.
Yeah.
That you are tending people, trying to bring them back to health, or if not, at least making their one-way journey, was his phrase, as comfortable as possible. Well, he prevented Amherst from becoming a one-way journey.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about a little earlier. He never took himself seriously, in the sense that he never
didn't take things personally.
That's right. He didn't take it personally, and he didn't pretend that this was some eminence that he had attained.
Exactly.
And that was a great lesson to me. I mean, I have those instincts anyway, but to work under somebody who has that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Bill had that feeling less, I think.
There's no question about it.
Yeah.
I mean, he said at the end that, well, it raises an issue as to whether coming from the faculty is where you're assuming certain relationships and you're quite startled that they have radically changed once you become a president. Collegiality is not available in the same degree. Making that leap, we don't want to go too far without mentioning the coeducational process. It can be imagined to be analogous to much that we've been talking about. It's going to happen, you just keep the ball rolling, but that took a heck of a long time.
Well, my argument, I helped co-educate 5 institutions in that period of time, one of which was Concord Academy, which went the other way. And some of the conversations were priceless. But my argument about Amherst was, look, they're only, aside from Jesuit institutions, the only 2 institutions left which have all male student bodies are the Mass Maritime College and Amherst. I
think, if I may correct you, I think Wabash.
No, but this is Massachusetts I was talking about.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I said it's a singular disadvantage to men to bring them up as undergraduates when they never encounter brighter women. Which of course they did through 5 colleges, but they're going to be in law firms and doctors' offices and engineering businesses where women are going to be their bosses. Mm-hmm. And they better get used to the fact that they're equally as bright, quicker, and have different emotional reactions. And, and that argument usually stumped people because they didn't have an easy answer to that one. Except that, well, of course, you have Holyoke and Smith.
Well, you and I can think of a lot of answers. Like, yeah, that's the trouble with law firms. But, I mean, Bill's son said to him, you know, your president's going, what the hell kind of college is it where this is an issue?
Yeah.
But it took the Long-Range Planning Committee, you weren't on that, were you? I mean, Cal announced the Long-Range Planning Committee when the first moratorium wave hit, and they were going to look ahead to the future. And there were 7 categories: administration, 5, Valley cooperation, coeducation was one of them, curricular matters, and Fink and DeMott and KTEB were the faculty represented or members of that committee, and it was very small. Conclusion: we ought to go co-ed. Now, that was in maybe 70. 5 years later, we went coeducational. Bill became president in 71.
Yeah.
And he, leading up to his feelings here, he said this isn't well worked out enough. He didn't approach the subject the way you have. This is going to happen. Was he, not antithetical, but was he unsure about the whole damn thing? Do you think? Because it would be very easy to have said, and Williams did, rather, we're going co-ed and we'll work out the details. But the longer it went on, the opposition came from
Well, there was
every
a lot of
nook and cranny.
there was a lot of alumni opposition, and there was board opposition. But it's interesting, thinking back on it. Bill Ward and I never had sort of conversations at the philosophical level. We never really sat down and argued.
About co-ed, for example?
Well, about almost anything. I mean, we had procedural discussions about, how are we going to get through this and what are we going to do next. But at the philosophical level, why do you believe that women should be treated absolutely equally? We never talked about that. And I don't know quite why, but we didn't. We didn't have an easy rapport. I mean, nowhere near like
you and
Cal. But
well, he had his faculty friends from American Studies,
right.
and there was greater rapport. It just, I mean, I couldn't imagine we wouldn't do this, and most of the faculty felt likewise.
Right.
But it took, what really tipped it was Ted Green's 5-college, Bill kept making task force to look into this more and more and more, and there wasn't a previous committee that could handle the question of how are other institutions faring that have gone co-ed. Well, the amount of time and money and paper that was spent, so to speak, to prove that Princeton is still standing, Yale looks as if it will be, and it wasn't a single red flag that they detected after all these years. That's what I'm pretty sure that's what finally convinced people.
Well, having had 3 daughters, all of whom, as it happened, went to Yale, but it was never a question in my mind that.
No, it seems.
I remember this is a little off the point because it's a Yale story, but quite true. It was at the Yale Club, and it must have been in New York, and it must have been in the 72, 73 years, because Yale went co-ed about 75 or 6. 75, maybe even earlier.
I think it had to have been earlier.
It was
Amherst
earlier.
was
Yeah,
75.
It was earlier. Anyway, just before that happened, there was this meeting, and some of the older members were very disturbed because they thought that if you let in a lot of women, you'd reduce the male undergraduate population, and that would hurt the football team. So I said at this meeting, I said, well, Yale and Dartmouth just played last weekend, and who won? And I said, Dartmouth's a lot smaller than Yale, and they don't seem to have trouble with the football team.
Yeah.
And all these arguments,
Well, of course, we accommodated to the degree that we went up to 1,600.
yeah.
It was a reduction of the male population, but there was something of a...
Well, Yale did the same, but
Yeah.
there was a reduction, but...
But you could still win a few ball games.
yeah.
And the other argument was music. Somehow it looked as if there'd never be the singing college again, because as if women didn't have voices, which metaphorically, we're
Right.
being informal. But my favorite anecdote as to the tenor of things is when the college, the faculty, you remember, made Ellen Ryerson and Rose the faculty representative. That was a fairly clear message
Right.
as to how the faculty felt. And they had a meeting in New York with the assembled trustees and the alumni representatives and so on. And they met at the Century Club,
Uh-huh.
which,
Which was in the throes of the same...
no, long before. They didn't allow women. And
Oh.
so Rose and Ellen had to be scarfed up in a service elevator in raincoats or something.
Oh, I was involved in that argument,
you-
too, both at the Century and at the Cosmos in Washington. I mean, it was absurd, but,
Was he for coeducation?
oh, I think so. I think
He was a
He-
member of the Exeter board, and
he was very sensitive to the
yeah,
the alumni relations. He never articulated it that way, but that was part of him. But I don't think he ever had any doubt
that it would occur.
that it would occur and should occur. On the other hand, he wasn't driving towards it in any,
No.
but he never stopped what I was up to.
Did you have occasion to? Well, you were at some of those meetings, and therefore you were making your point.
I remember it.
And Chuck Longsworth certainly was.
Yeah. I remember a meeting of the Amherst alumni in Cleveland. And I was the after-dinner speaker, and I spoke. And then there was a question period. Well, the question period went on about an hour and a half. And I was just being used as the intermediary. What was happening was the old guard was speaking to the newer alumni. And so the questions were to me, but they were really to the other side of the
There were
room.
lectures to the other side. Do you think, we've both been to other institutions, neither of us is an Amherst alum. Do you have a sense of the positive here that the Amherst alum has certainly a loyalty to his institution, the likes of which I never saw. There are segments of loyalists at the institutions we know, but I've always felt that one thing that can be said about this is that this is our college.
I think it was particularly true of the alumni that went through what was called the new curriculum.
Yeah.
Because everybody did the same thing,
Good point. Yeah.
and there was a cohesiveness there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that became clear to me, losing my voice, Amherst is a very faculty-run institution.
You say that neutrally. I have heard administrators say, if I knew how faculty, I would never have come here.
No, I found it a very interesting experience. I mean, the colleagues on the committee of 6 were on the whole very good people.
Mm-hmm.
But it does create a different atmosphere. Even when the faculty are very strong, as they are at Yale, you don't get the sense that the structure of the university is faculty driven, which it isn't. So I think that has also has an aspect on the kind of cohesiveness of the experience.
That makes good sense. Yeah.
And, Amherst alumnus meets another one, and he says, well, do you remember Kim Townsend? Well, most people will remember Kim Townsend.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say, do you remember Professor X at Yale, they may or may not ever have encountered him.
Mm-hmm. One of the, back to co-ed for 1 second, one of the most dramatic examples of this is when the faculty just said to the board, in effect, we don't accept your decision. And Merrill and others were sitting in that bullfighting arena where we meet, which is not irrelevant. And I think that was a very unusual and important event.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the architecture of the Red Room does make a difference.
Well, you were talking about dress codes, but the move from faculty meetings in the Babbitt Room, where up top of the octagon, which is where we met when I first got here, and I mean, I laugh in retrospect. I was in the cheap seats in the back and an instructor, and we weren't allowed to vote. And there was a pecking order up front on both sides with chairs like this of eminence. And I mean, the hierarchy was just lethal. But then you get into this bull ring pit, cockfighting pit, a symbolic Red Room.
With only two of us down at the table.
Yeah. An important event in these years, when you look back on it, that you served as Dean of the Faculty for 2 eras. I mean, there's the Plimpton era and there's the Ward era.
Yeah.
And I said it, just want to repeat it, that on an occasion in crises in both administrations, you were head of the college because they were out of town. And in the latter instance, in '72, Ward was in Paris and got on an earlier flight than he had planned. But that led up to Westover, and that's what we haven't mentioned. And I think it'd be interesting to hear your views on Bill's getting arrested at Westover. It didn't take up as much time as the coeducation issues, but I can tell you, having been to those archives, there's something like 2,000 letters on the subject. It took up a lot of forestry if it didn't take up a lot of time.
Well, I was, that would not have been my initial response to go sit in Westover. And I went to be supportive of Bill. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't that I thought it was a bad idea. I just didn't think it was the most compatible with what I ever stood for. So even though it clearly became a symbolic event, it was not one in which I'd invested a lot of thought or energy. And some people, I mean, including my wife, thought it was counterproductive. And there was an argument that that was true, but in any case, it wasn't to me one of the seminal events. I think it became seminal because there was so much opposition on the board and in the alumni.
Well, if you get back to Cleveland, so to speak,
mm-hmm.
You don't have to be a sophisticated sociologist to know that the vote went exactly along an age spectrum, because I still hear, because of this project, from undergraduates who, younger alumni, and if you go through the faculties of alumni, it's faculties in the humanities that like it and medical professors don't. I mean, it's very, very simple, but the alumni opposition, for the most part, tended to be, as it was in Cleveland, of the older
Right.
alumni and the younger people, I don't think either of them defined the issue very well. They were either for it or against it, and whatever it entailed, well, we'll accept that or we'll reject that too. Which leads me back to your word symbolic. What do you think it symbolized? What was the nature of the gesture? And I'm getting to the question that was central to the debate at the time as to whether or not this was a personal action.
Well, I think my sense at the time was that Bill wanted to do something which was over and above what we'd done before. And as he surveyed the options, this seemed like a pretty good one. And, you know, all of us as academics can rationalize almost anything.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, I wasn't against it, but I didn't think it was a great idea. And I supported it simply because I didn't want, you know, the dean of the faculty going off in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember one board meeting, because I used to sit in on the board meeting. The subject of hair came up, and somebody made a derogatory comment about all these beards and hair and all that. So I said, well, would some of you come with me down to the gym?
Yeah.
And you go, and their whole team, with every person has a. So I said, well, now what about that? And they said, oh, well, that was the style. And I didn't say a thing. I mean, the kind of willful blindness on some of this stuff is amazing.
Yeah, yeah. There was strong opposition to Bill's getting arrested from certain members of the faculty that you would have thought were very supportive on what you said with Bill, and obviously didn't talk about it philosophically, but on a small p, philosophical grounds, that this isn't the way Amherst did business.
Well, I had some of that feeling myself.
Yeah. How did you feel about the blurring of the line between the person and the institution? I mean, there were people, a handful, who got arrested before from the faculty.
Mm-hmm.
No hoopla. They
Right.
did it. And nobody made much of it. And there was no intention on the part of these six that much should be made of it. But clearly, this was a gesture that came with.
Yeah. Well, I think that was part of the uneasiness that some of us felt. Well, I remember. I don't think you were involved, but the support of the black institutions in the South. I flew down with Lou Mudge.
Yeah.
And Tuskegee and he coming back, not on our trip, but the trip before, he discovered one of his gas tanks went dry, and fortunately he had 2 engines, but somebody had bored a hole in his fuel line when the plane was down in.
Contextualize this. The purpose of the trip was, I mean, I know Lou flew down to Selma.
Well, this was support. We had Amherst was supporting a sort of tutorial summer program at Tuskegee. And there were a couple of undergraduates down there, and he was very interested in this. And I went down, and I think On that trip, I was the only one, but I think others went down at other times with him.
Hmm.
And, but I mean, you were talking about people standing up for things, and
Yeah.
there certainly was a lot of that. And
But I don't know if it's an easy bridge to the questions that I've asked, observations we've been making about being an administrator. It's just, tell me, once you take on such a job, you have a relationship with the institution that a faculty member doesn't. And are you not precluded from thinking that, Bill always used to say one of the great things about the job is I can pick up the phone and call somebody and they'll talk to me because I'm president of Amherst College. I'll pick up the phone and call someone and they'll say, he's busy. But, I've
well, there certainly is. I mean, there certainly is an institutional aura, institutional. I mean, you certainly feel out the Library of Congress. I'd make a telephone call and say that I'm at the Library of Congress and I wanted, and that seemed to be something rather special.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I was very reluctant to use that unless I was talking, if I was talking to the council at Harvard, of course, it was important that I was.
Identify yourself.
Yeah, but I mean, it's clear that when you're an administrator, you carry a different kind of burden. You can't do things just because it feels good.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I never felt, partially because I taught, and I never felt really at odds with the faculty in any way. I mean, there were some people who probably didn't like me and some people I didn't mix with much, but I never had difficulty with rapport.
Well, you knew which hat you were wearing in which room, on which occasion. I'm just remembering all these years and events, and I'm jumping back for a minute. Do you remember the cross burning? One of the saddest.
I remember it.
I mean, it's one of Bill's last experiences. When he discovered that it had been done by black students.
I remember the event, but I don't remember that I may not have been here. Because I was away.
I think it was 78, it's towards the very end. And I mention it because it was a sad ending.
Yeah.
He went ballistic over this after all he'd done and all he'd tried to do. Particularly, I mean, he seemed to have been very good at supporting, yes, black studies, the greater number of black students, and the campus was having another one of its throes, and because it had seemed that this was a racist gesture, and certainly not.
I don't remember being involved in it. It could have been that I was somewhere else.
Well, one thing, it's
I might have been at
by
Dutch
that
Show.
time, things were discernibly wearing down after the highlights of Westover and coeducation, 72 to 5, and the thing that was propelling the downward movement was, and maybe you have some recollection of this, although I don't think it was directly on your plate, but was the argument over salaries, which never came up so markedly with Cal. And perhaps as dean of the faculty, that's less your than Kurt's.
Well, again, you mentioned it in your paper. I don't remember that. I remember discussions about it, but I don't remember that being in any way a sort of crisis.
The subject being salaries?
Salaries.
Yeah.
And it may be that for both that and the cross-bearing, I was with somewhere else because I don't remember being involved in those.
I know you had some leaves, time off in
Yeah.
these years.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I could just
And
throw
then
it.
I had, because I remember Bruce Morgan and then Arnold Collery both stepped
Both
in.
stood in, yeah.
Both of whom I think are dead. I think.
Maybe this is a glance backward to something we began with, and maybe you'll have a comment on this, whether you remember minute by minute or not. The issue was, and there was some confusion of memos and baselines, whether, and we were in an inflationary period, so that the buying power of the faculty
Mhm.
was under some stress. There were some people who thought it wasn't the most impoverished and trying activity possible, to say the least. But at any rate, the issue was Amherst's salary scale to be compared to that of, quote, comparable institutions, i.e. small liberal arts colleges of a certain quality, or was it to the best institutions in the country, i.e. Harvard, Yale, blah, blah. And that became the way of framing the argument. And it came down on the side of the former, much to the dismay of many faculty members who thought that the latter scale was one.
I would not have come down on the former myself, because I don't think. I mean, those institutions may be comparable in certain respects, but they certainly aren't comparable in their academic standing, in their undergraduate bodies. And the surprising thing about Amherst faculty was that a lot of them did research. I mean, when we got that Sloan Neuroscience grant, for instance, we were about the first college to get it. So I think now whether they should be on a par with Harvard, I mean, who's on a par with Harvard? But I think the comparison is with first-rate institutions, not with similarly sized institutions. So I would certainly have been in that category.
Well, you and Bill might have had a rare philosophical discussion towards the end on that, because I think he came down on the former, much to the chagrin of the faculty. And that, after all that had happened, after all of the commotion, disturbance of your 12 years, to have this the final issue.
Well, of course, there are realities and constraints. I mean, independent of what you believe to be correct, if there isn't the money there, you can't pay it. And I don't know, I mean, I've always thought Amherst is among the wealthier institutions per student, per faculty member, et cetera. But you know, Amherst is in that department, Amherst is nowhere in the league with Harvard and Yale, which are managing billions. I mean, 10, 11 billion.
Therefore, these salaries are more readily available. One thing Bill did do, which I'm sure you were aware of, was try to close the gap between senior and junior faculty.
Yeah. Well, that's important too.
And that's of a piece.
Yeah.
Alas, that wasn't always popular with seniors. Luckily, you and I aren't going to get old and turn into one of these figures. But there's a very clear generational war going on in these over these various issues. Um, we've been staying within the college limits successfully. Your work subsequently, I think it's important that as we started with what led to Amherst, it's been a lot of time, and you've, as you once wrote me, so many other activities have followed that it's hard to remember what was
Yeah, I kind
what
of
we think is absolutely the alpha and the omega of the human experience.
Yeah, I kind of had two careers subsequently. I went from here to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which was the first. It was really through Moynihan. It was set up under Nixon. It was the first presidential memorial that wasn't bricks and mortar. It was monies for people to come and work postdoctorally in humanities and social sciences. There's no science because there was no labs, but history of science, philosophy of science. But basically it was humanity. And that was a marvelous, I spent 8 years there, and that was a marvelous, because we had fellows from all over the world, and this was when Eastern Europe was in turmoil, and we had a lot of people from Eastern Europe. Africa was beginning to gear up, post-colonially to all sorts of unfortunate things. And Asia was just beginning to grow into young tigers. And we had all these folks, and I ran conferences in New Delhi, in Bellagio, and Texas. It was an exciting period, and again, the intellectual heritage was one of cross-cultural. I forget what year it was, but I ran because all the seminars at the Wilson Center were voluntary. I mean, we couldn't tell people. But I ran one that was a comparison between Eastern Europe and Africa, because at this point they both had socialist governments, and they both had strong dissident populations. And so the Rockefeller Foundation got interested, and we ran a big conference at Bellagio, week-long, very unusual conference at Bellagio, comparing these two sets with a good many participants from both camps. And that's the sort of thing that was fascinating. Then,
did that ever result in a publication? Did you
well,
have
it should have.
proceedings?
It should have, but in the end it didn't. Two previous ones had resulted in books, but at this one, it must have been fairly late 80s, because it coincided in time with a new director. Jim Billington, who'd been the director of the Wilson Center, was made Librarian of Congress. So I was in charge, technically. And then they hired a new director who, in my view, was a disaster. And I told them that, and it took them about 5 years. It took Congress about 5 years, but Congress finally said, look, this guy's got to go, or we're not going to support the institution anymore. So he fired me, which turned out to be a great stroke of luck. So I spent a year in Europe. I was at the École des Hautes Études in Paris, and ended up then at the Library of Congress as the first director of scholarly programs, which was also quite exciting, but it became more exciting when John Kluge dropped $60 million on us. And Jim said, you set it up. So I did. And, in a curious way, I was the first dean of the faculty. Well, I was the first person that Brewster asked to set things up. Then the first dean of the faculty. Then I really designed the programs at the Wilson Center and then at the library. So it was all was a great, I had enormous latitude. And, but the Kluge Center was sort of more of the same. It was bringing very distinguished people in and interacting with them. And I found that, well, it was much like being dean of the faculty in a sense. You had to, you had to talk to, Polish politicians and Romanian economists and esoteric students of literature, and so it was a marvelous career.
What year have we gotten up to?
I stayed at the Library of Congress until I was 75, so that was 2005. So I'm just in my 6th year of full retirement to Woods Hole. And there again, I'm reasonably active because I had been...
You've always been active there.
I had been chairman of the board of the Marine Biological Lab for 12 years, which was a volunteer position.
More or less, I'm cutting across this chronological bow to mix metaphors. You've avoided being a college president, which is to say you've avoided fundraising.
Pretty much.
You don't seem to regret that.
No. I was asked actually at a couple of points whether I wanted to be college president, but I didn't.
I don't seem to regret this.
No, I don't regret it. And the places that asked me were not places I wanted to be president of in any case. But no, I think I think my course was correct. And as I say, when you look back on it, it looks like it's all part of a piece. But at every stage, I mean...
Well, surely we can end with a Woods Hole metaphor. You're a sailor, aren't you? I mean, you've tacked.
That's right.
You've tacked well.
And I think, and I've always said to our kids, their generation, nobody's going to stay in one career. They may stay in one career broadly defined, but they're going to zigzag. I mean, you've got to, I think, if you want to. If you want to do things in which you have a real interest.
Well, it's been a great pleasure.